Hi, I'm Nabila and I just finished these pants after hitting several struggles along the way, most of which I covered in my last video. But I wanted to make this video about one specific issue I ran into with these pants, which was sewing French seams with inseam pockets. There are a lot of great tutorials on this specific topic and I'll link one of those down below, but my issue was that I was using a different shape of inseam pocket. All the inseam pocket tutorials that I saw had a pocket shaped like this, which kind of has a facing on one side and a pocket bag on the other, and it kind of has a notch for separation on the space where your hands go into the pocket. But the pocket that I was designing was more of a rectangular shape with no separation between the facing and pocket bag, meaning if I had followed the tutorials and sewed the pocket bag up exactly how they wanted to, I would end up with a large hole for the hand opening. Now for these pants, I did go ahead and follow the tutorial exactly, and I ended up with that large opening for the pocket. So at the end, I just sandwiched those pieces one on top of another and stitched down along the French seam, and that fixed the problem that I was having. But today I want to make a sample and kind of reverse engineer how these pockets have finished their French seams, because I just feel like it looks a bit neater. Here are the pattern pieces that I cut out to make my sample. So the two larger rectangular pieces are my front and back, and then my pocket is that smaller rectangular piece. I wanted to note that my pocket piece is cut on fold to reduce bulk, so it's the front and back in one continuous piece, and I went ahead and gave that a good press along the folded edge. So the first step is to finish the pocket bag. I'm going to be using French seams at a half seam allowance. So starting with wrong sides facing each other, I'll sew it at a 1/2 inch and then trim that seam allowance back. Then I'll turn this inside out so right sides are together, and I'll press this so everything lays flat before sewing this seam again at a 1/2 inch. Now I'll sew just the front pocket opening to the front panel right sides together at a 1/2 seam allowance. Again, we're not sewing down the whole pocket here, we are just sewing down where the hand opening for the pocket is. Just a note here, this is the only seam that will not be French seamed for this project. Watch the end of this video for a quick note on seam allowance for this project. After sewing those two pieces together, I'll clip that seam where I backstitched and press it out so that the notch where the pocket bag is unstitched is facing outwards. I top stitched here to reinforce the seam, and this is technically optional, but I would highly suggest at least understitching here. Then for that notch that I had left over where the pocket bag is unstitched, I'll sew that wrong sides together at a 4th seam allowance. Next, I'll take my back piece and I'll sew this wrong sides together at a 4th seam allowance because we're French seaming this side. Keep in mind that we're sewing wrong sides facing to the back side of the pocket bag now. Sewing this might seem kind of tricky, but all I'm doing is making sure I'm sewing just the pocket bag and back panel together, and I just pivoted the pocket bag out by 45 degrees to make this just a little easier until I get to the end of the pocket. And then I'll hold everything stacked on one another to finish the side seam all the way down. This next part I guess I could have included in my last step, but now I'm going to sew the front notch to my back panel so that all 4 of these layers are stitched together. Then I'll finish everything off like a regular French seam. I trimmed away the seam allowance and gave everything a good press, and then I sewed right sides together at a 4th seam allowance. I put a pin in my front pocket to hold it a little bit open, just so I don't accidentally sew my pocket shut. And here's how it looks all done. I'll show you all the inside pieces so you can see what it looks like. You'll notice that there are still some raw edges here where the pocket bag meets the front piece, and that's why I recommend top stitching or understitching. And also make sure you use an interfacing along the pocket opening to give this just a little bit more support and structure. A quick note about seam allowance. where the pocket bag and the front piece meet, that seam allowance is different than the side seam allowance, so that when everything is French seamed, they will line up. So your seam allowance for the pocket opening should be double whatever you decide your French seam allowance should be for the rest of the garment. I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much for watching and happy sewing.